are finally moving to the topic of today, which is Agile for UX researchers. We have Jill, who is a research director at WillowTree, and Jill is joined by her colleague Emily, who is who's program director also at WillowTree, and they will be sharing their perspective of collaboration and how can we make research and Agile work effectively together. So I give the stage to them. I stop sharing, and you can start sharing your slides, Jill and Emily. Super excited to have you here.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for this forum, Cochran, UXinsight. I just can't tell you how impressed I've been in working to put this content together about how supportive you are of UX researchers in the industry. So just many thanks to you and all of you who are dedicating a portion of your time, which I understand may be the holidays for many of you, to really skill up in this area of Agile, which I think is so important for research. So without further ado, we will get into it here. So I will share my screen, and to begin here, we'll get to introductions in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But first I wanted to share a story with you all that really influenced my thinking about Agile and sort of my motivation for really digging into what it means and how UX research works within the structures. So back a number of years ago, I was at a different organization and I had a UX team that I was leading, and we were working with another development team who needed some resources from me in terms of UX research and design, and they were working in an Agile sort of framework. I was talking with the product owner, just really trying to get a feel about how my team members should work within their structure and how we should partner together very early on in this project. And what this product owner told me was, oh, you don't really have to worry about it. We're just doing back-end work. And at the time, I'd been doing UX, but I didn't really know a whole lot about Agile. And even though my gut told me, gosh, that doesn't sound right, because surely whatever you're doing on the back end is going to impact what the end user experience is going to be, right? Like, it's relevant to be in that conversation, but I just didn't have the words or understanding to really advocate effectively for myself. And so we missed that window when there were these kind of key architectural decisions happening that in fact really did impact what users would see at the end of the day. And so I, kind of kicked myself for that, but I really don't want my fellow researchers to feel in a similar situation where, you really feel kind of marginalized, maybe unempowered to be effective just because we don't really kind of know how these frameworks work. We absolutely belong in the conversation around back-end work, just so that you're assured, and we're going to talk about how you get there in this presentation. So the thing I want to call out about why this matters, in addition to being empowered when you run into circumstances like what I just described, is that Agile is really pervasive if you're in the software space. I don't think I need to tell you, if you're a UX researcher, you've probably encountered some form of an Agile framework or sort of philosophy or something like that. And every year there is a report called the State of Agile report. And this year, the survey of over 4,000 people across the globe who work in the software space reported, 94% of them reported that their companies are practicing Agile in some form. That's pretty much everybody for all intents and purposes. So it's very pervasive. 52% of respondents say the majority of all of their company's teams have adopted Agile. So it's not just that they're, it's happening a little bit in the company, but the majority of the company is really actively involved. And another 86% report that their software development teams are using Agile. And what I always like to call out, because I think it's interesting, is that yes, the survey was, among folks in software development communities, but even in those organizations, 17% report that their marketing teams are using Agile, and we're seeing it pop up in other areas of the business where you might not naturally kind of think about it. It's certainly not where Agile grew out of, but those numbers grow every year. So no doubt, you're going to bump into it, and by understanding it, you can be better partners, you can be more effective. So with that, I did want to back up and just talk a little bit about where Emily and I are coming from with respect to our experience with Agile and just our backgrounds. As Anna said, I'm a research director for a company called WillowTree. And what we do at WillowTree, we're a digital product agency. So, my job is to help manage and be an individual contributor on software projects for typically work with very large clients with very complex and frankly fun problems to solve. I've been wearing a lot of research hats over the years. I've done kind of market research, competitive intelligence work. I was a librarian. That's actually kind of where my master's comes from, my educational background. But I really emphasize, leading research on cross-functional teams, and I've been doing that kind of work in the UX space for about 10 years. I have my Agile certified Scrum product owner and safe Agile certification. So really spent some time getting formal training in that as well. So excited to share that with you. And now I'm going to let Emily finally introduce herself after all my talking.
Yeah, so I'm Emily Cochran. I'm a program director by profession. That's what my official job title is. But when I explain to people what I really do, I focus a lot on team dynamics. I focus on making sure that everyone feels heard and respected, and that we really dig down and spend a lot of time figuring out how to discover what a great product is. And so that means listening to a lot of people and learning to a lot of people. And so I have a lot of the same trainings and some additional trainings too around that are kind of the necessary piece for being an effective program director. But at my core, I like to focus on communication. Jill mentioned WillowTree's product agency, and I do want to call out that Jill and I have had the privilege of working together for almost 2 years on a client that highly values hearing directly from users. And so we certainly have a lot of experience in working together and finding ways that work. But I do just want to acknowledge that a little later in the presentation, we're going to talk about finding an advocate. And I will say having this particular client and a lot of the clients at WillowTree to create that space and prioritize that has been hugely helpful. And enabled a playground, if you will, for us to figure out what Agile and UX research look like working together.
Yeah, and I'll just add, gosh, it was so fun working with Emily. We still have talks about Agile, and we're like, how would you do that? Or what do you think about this? Or how would we do it a different way? And so we're like definitely thought partners. We don't normally coordinate how we dress. That just sort of happens by luck, I suppose. So in any case, that's enough about us, but I would love to get to know a little bit about you all who are attending and get a sense of where you're coming from with respect to your roles and experience with Agile. So I am going to try my hand here at a couple of polls. And the first one really just asks you, I'm going to launch it here. And it just asks you what best describes your role. I know these job titles might not align perfectly with the work that you do, and they can be a little squishy, but to the best of your ability, can you, peg yourself in one of these categories? And then there's another question there. So there's actually 2 questions in this one poll, but the second is which best describes your position? Kind of individual contributor, are you managing teams? What sort of, fits your kind of current status? And then we'll give you a couple minutes or a couple seconds to fill that out, and then we'll take a look. Still have people clicking, so, all right. About 75% of you responded. So I'm going to end the poll and share that with you, but awesome. So hopefully you are seeing what I'm seeing in the results here. So no surprise, lots of UX researchers. That's awesome. You're my people. So glad to have you here. Also nice to see UX designers. I know a lot of you are doing research out there as well and being, really close partners with your research colleagues. And yes, 10% of you are something else. I didn't peg you. I'm so sorry, but you are very welcome here. In fact, I see a couple of product owners, Scrum or Agile coaches rather, managers, and that's wonderful because I think what I have found is that we all have a role to play kind of in advocating for and understanding research and how it all kind of fits together to make good products. So the more functions, the better. And furthermore, let's see what best describes your position. 57% are individual contributors. So yeah, totally feel you there. 9% managers. We have also some freelancers. And again, something else I didn't peg, but welcome anyway. All right. So that was poll 1. And we're going to go now to poll 2. And this is a little bit more around your experience with Agile. You graciously shared a little bit of that at registration, and I got some sense of kind of where you're coming from, but would love to know a little more. So the next 2 questions are around how you would rate your Agile knowledge. Are you just kind of getting started? Maybe you don't even know anything about it, but you're just interested, or you've kind of heard some of the buzzwords, that kind of thing. Intermediate, maybe you're on a team, you've done some reading, you're digging into it, maybe don't feel expert, but you're on your way. And then advanced, you've got this and you can kind of help us help each other when we get stumped on a question. Is there, oh, I thought I might have heard someone on audio ask your question. Oh, it was on mute. Okay. The second question, yeah, how effective is your organization in including researchers in Agile? Not at all, a little bit. What do you think? All right. Got about 56%. So more people clicking. Okay. We'll go ahead and end the poll and share it back just to get a little snapshot here. Awesome. So most of it, there's kind of a decent, spread across all the categories of Agile knowledge. That's really awesome to see. So I think this tells me we can be a resource to one another during the session today and beyond. So if you make connections here, it looks like you've got some folks to lean on who have some expertise. That's fantastic. How effective is your organization, including researchers and Agile teams? Okay, so again, I think we're veering on that in that particular case, a little bit more toward the not so effective side of things, which, that's why we're here today. We're going to help you with that. Thank you for sharing a little bit about yourselves. I'm excited to get to know you and connect, hopefully, after this as well. All right. Moving on. So this is our plan for today. So Anna went through at a high level what the schedule looks like. So I'm just going to dig into what we hope to present and how all that will work. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just what Agile is to begin with. And there's a lot of misperceptions and disconnects around Agile, and we're going to dig into what those are. I suspect some of you know that pretty well firsthand. And then we're going to talk about getting in the right mindset. If you do any reading in Agile or you go to a training session, I think one of the first things they're going to talk to you about is that Agile is, in fact, a mindset. I think Emily and I have kind of, through our work together, figured out other nuances to the mindsets you want to help create within your teams that we'll share with you. But the reason that we talk about it up front is it's so critical and so important and foundational to everything else we're going to do on the tactics side. So in terms of the tactical elements that we want to talk to you about, we're going to talk about it in two phases. So the first part is about planning. Agile is all about responding to change over following a plan. But in reality, in practice, some amount of planning, even if that's going to change over time as you learn more information or whatever the case, gives you this kind of shared place to start and just react and be able to move forward with. So some element and some amount of planning has really been useful for us. And then in terms of tactics, we're going to talk about implementation. So you kind of got the plan in place, you've got your game plan ready, and now how do you actually turn that into reality? We'll show you what we did with that. And then we're going to talk about your questions. So again, Anna's talked about how we're going to handle that, put them in the chat, and then we'll get to them. Okay. So from here, I think I'm going to turn it over to Emily to talk about some Agile basics.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about why we're even talking about Agile, why anybody talks about Agile. Jill covered how prevalent it is with a lot of the studies, but what about before Agile? So before Agile, you had this notion of waterfall. So imagine writing hundreds or even thousands of pages of documentation, these huge books, ironing out every detail, and spending months, if not years, finding the quote unquote perfect solution. As you can imagine, this is highly risky. You have longer terms projects, there's higher costs, value isn't being released incrementally. And so instead, Agile focuses on delivering value to the customer sooner and more frequently. Back in 2001, 17 developers sat down in a room and decided there's got to be a better way. And at its core, what they came up with is Agile is effectively 4 values and 12 principles. That's it. That's all Agile is. I do want to call out a side note that this is specifically 17 developers, and I think had any designers been there, the screenshots that we took directly from the Agile Manifesto website would probably look a little different. We know that they're great. The content in them is great, but I imagine that they would be slightly more readable had we involved some other UX folks in there. And so we talk about, you may have heard some of these other Agile related frameworks. I really like the way that they talk about frameworks, right? It's not super prescriptive. But the one that we're going to focus on is Scrum. And so 66% of those surveyed in the State of the Agile report that Jill talked about identified Scrum as the most prevalent methodology. And so that's the one that we're going to focus most of our conversation around. And so what is Scrum? It's a lightweight framework. So you may have heard of terms such as sprints or stand-ups or daily Scrum. All of those are around Scrum. Scrum is not Agile, but Scrum is rather a lightweight framework. And so we're going to explore that more in the following slides. So you have a Scrum team for the Scrum projects. So you've got a product owner, a Scrum master, and developers are the official roles. When you think about a Scrum team, you typically talk about it as being able to feed a group of people that can sit at a table and eat a single pizza kind of among themselves. And so the Scrum kind of framework, the lightweight frameworks that exist, there's usually a unit of time. So a sprint, so it's typically 2 to 4 weeks. There's a product backlog. So effectively there's a list of user stories. So Jill's going to dive more into talk about what user stories are and why they're important. There's a notion of sprint planning. And so that really is everyone coming together and the development team committing to doing a certain amount of work during a sprint. There's the daily Scrum. You may have heard it referred to as stand-up. It's a quick daily touch point where the entire team touches base on the work that they've committed to for their sprint. There's also the sprint review that you might sometimes hear also called a demo, where you can review that sprint's worth of work. And then the sprint retro, which is really for the entire team to come together and to be agile and to think about what are the things that are working, what are the things that don't, and what are the things that they want to kind of play with and try to change. And you'll hear Jill and I talk a lot about mindset and a playground and things that we can kind of play with. In my experience, it's been highly valuable to have researchers and designers sit in on all of the Scrum meetings. Researchers and designers are not officially part of that group of the Scrum team that I mentioned at the beginning that includes a product owner, a Scrum master, and developer. I think they fit most closely with the product owners. And so you'll hear me talk a lot about Scrum-ish. We're not about doing things by the book, right? Not about going to the Scrum website and reading through theirs and being prescriptive. A lot of the pieces that you're going to hear us talk about today are our experience and how we've been able to make it work. And so we're going to think about all of these meetings as opportunities for collaboration. And later on in the presentation, we'll dive into a couple of them and give some kind of concrete examples about how you can think about really inserting yourself and what does it look like to find a partner and to prompt the team to perhaps think about things a little bit differently.
Yeah, so I don't think that this next slide will be much of a surprise to many of you. As Emily pointed out, I really like this analogy of the Scrum team being folks who can sit around and eat a pizza together. Like I hadn't heard that before. But originally, officially, as part of Scrum teams, researchers aren't, at the pizza party essentially. So I think you kind of sense a lot of that feeling of being force fitting research into Agile, like kind of retrospectively. And I think it kind of grows out just of the origins. So that can feel really uncomfortable. Maybe you've experienced this as a, particular tension, which, really revolves around finding time to do just enough research. Maybe you feel like you have to do something just really quick because it's better to have some research after all than none at all, but maybe it's not the quality that you'd like to ultimately have. Or maybe you skinny down your sample sizes so that you can get to results faster, but then your confidence suffers as a result. Maybe you're trading off a methodology for a simpler or faster one, but that might not be the best fit for the question you're trying to answer. Or maybe you're just trying to figure out, gosh, what meetings do I attend? And if I go to a sprint planning meeting, what do I do there? What's the purpose? Those kinds of questions. So all of those tensions, if you're feeling any of those, if they sound familiar, it's just a symptom that research is not flourishing in that Agile environment. And in my view, shocking, I believe research is crucial for Agile teams. I mean, the whole idea of us getting together as a team in the first place is to build something that users care about. And how the heck can we do that if we don't understand user needs and we're not capturing that information in a really systematic and rigorous way? So the trick is we want to do research. We want to keep its integrity intact, while at the same time moving forward. I think you all, kind of get that. But what I think just in terms of how we should think about this is it's not so much reframe, having the problem stated as, how do we fit research into Agile teams? It's really more about the problem of getting our Agile teams to really understand the work that's necessary, the research work that's necessary to really understand what it is we're building. And then we have to plan and scope for that. And that's really what research needs, to focus on. And we got a lot of questions about that, how to do that tactically. We'll certainly talk about that in greater depth. But I want you to know that it's really not how do we squeeze research in, it's like how do we make space for this important work. So that requires a mindset shift, number of mindset shifts, in fact. And here, said we're going to talk about it. So here we go. Some of the mindsets that Emily and I have found in practice really help to get teams kind of centered on are the following. One is to have some conversations with your team around the relationship between outcomes and outputs. Both of them are important. I mean, obviously, we are here to build things, create things of value to people so that outputs matter. I don't want to diminish that. But we really have to have some conversations and shared understanding about the need to prioritize outcomes and put those on the same footing. So just to give you an example from the work Emily and I have done together. So we were building an app for an EV charging network. And as you can imagine, there's lots of things that app needs to be able to do. It needs to be able to help you, pay for a charge, find a charging station, start your charge, apply discounts, and all of those features that go into making the thing, yes, are important. But it's really the outcomes or the user impact that we're trying to get at. That's the whole purpose for that app existing in the first place. So in our case, if you imagine an electric vehicle driver out in the world, maybe going on a long distance trip for the first time, they need to have confidence and some peace of mind that they're going to be able to get to their destination. They're not going to run out of charge and be stranded somewhere, and those kinds of things. So really, what you can do then when you think about features like navigating to a station, how do we think about that problem in the context of an outcome, which is getting people safely and confidently to their next stop? So that's really important to get centered on as a team. And then I would say just kind of recognizing we aren't going to know everything up front. That might be ideal. I know we're researchers. We want to research stuff. We want to really understand the problem in a nuanced way. That's all well and good. But I mean, inevitably, things are going to change as we go. One of the 12 Agile principles, if you read the website, I definitely hope that you do, the Agile Manifesto site, those 12 principles that Emily showed, one of them states, we value welcoming changing requirements, even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. So all of us during the course of a project, we're going to think of unanticipated questions. We're going to find new problems. The landscape's going to change. Research is one of those key means of keeping our capacity for learning, growing, and keeping pace, with things. And that ability to pick up new information and apply it, that's where our competitive advantage is. That's the value that research brings to these teams, and it's really critical. So understand we need to be able to learn, and research has a role in that. Here's another one that took me, honestly, a while to really, really understand. And it took a lot of conversation with Emily, just kind of working it through. It does feel like a lot of times when you're asking to fit research in, which we said isn't the best way to think about it, that we're spending time, right? Oh, we need to make time for research or give research time. Research actually, when you think about it, helps to optimize the time that we do have. And it's really an investment. And it saves time and money and resources in the long run. So just an idea about what I mean about that. If we do a good job with our research, we're going to have more confidence about what we're building. We're going to understand the relative importance of different features. So we're going to be able to prioritize our work effectively. We're going to know where to invest. We're going to know where not to invest. We're not going to make a lot of mistakes that down the road we're going to have to fix later when it's more expensive. We've already maybe alienated users by that point. So it's really an investment and a time savings. It just doesn't always feel like it in the moment or up front, but that's the way I think we should be thinking about it. And then the other piece I want to talk about is conversation. So there is a tendency, I'm guilty of it, too. I managed a lot of projects with my cross-functional team back in the day. And, you can get really caught up in tickets, or, maybe you're looking at a user story. You're like, well, we've got to build this thing because this is what the user story says we need to do. I just want to encourage you and your team to think about making space for conversation about those artifacts that you're creating, because those things, those sticky notes or tickets or whatever, they're not the purpose for, why you're working together, not the end of what you're trying to do. They're really a means to getting to user value. So use those as jumping off points for conversation and questioning and curiosity, but don't look at them as fixed requirements. Emily, I have to credit for summarizing it so beautifully, but she said that Agile is a shared desire to figure things out. And I really love that framing. Like, if you can align around that intention that we're not going to know everything, but we're going to get through it together and we're going to make space to understand, I think that goes a long way to helping research be on a really good footing. And yeah, I'm still talking. So before I turn it over to Emily, I just want to say one more thing about pivoting your research focus to your Agile team. So I've said a lot of things that I think are beneficial for researchers, these preconditions or mindsets that I think do help researchers. But what I'm not saying is go to your teams and sell research like, oh, we're going to save you time and we're going to do, all these wonderful things, for you. I think in part that makes sense. But it can also feel like one more thing to do if you're just going in and saying we need to add research to the mix. So what I would encourage you to do is think about your teams in the same way you might think about your end users when you're doing a study. Actually use your team as like a source of information about how different functions work, what their major concerns are. Talk to the people about what they're building, why, what's their understanding. I have a few questions listed on the slide that you might want to think about as jumping off points for conversation with those folks. But I'm doing this very thing right now. I'm talking to developers, designers, and other people who have recently been working with researchers and just sort of understanding, hey, what worked well, what didn't. And I've learned a lot of rich data. Like, sometimes designers feel like they're in a little bit of a tug of war between the new user requirements researchers are generating and then what the developers are learning about what they're technically capable of. And so all these requirements are changing all the time. That's not great, but knowing that means I can go in and, be proactive or at least empathetic and understand, those challenges and deliver the research information in a way that helps to kind of ease that tension to the best of my ability. So turn your research focus on your team, be a good partner to them, and then I think you can kind of get research in the mix that way. But Emily has a really great perspective on this team dynamics that she'd like to share too.
Yeah, and when I think about my background and kind of what got me to here over the last 10 to 12 years, really what I've done is think about team dynamics and how groups of people work together. And so, like I said in my intro, I'm technically a product director. I work with Agile teams delivering software projects, but the perspective that I bring to this is really how do these different groups of people work together. And so I think one of the biggest learnings that I had when I started working with designers and researchers is you can understand their motivations. They're highly motivated towards solving problems for users. They've got their fingers more on the pulse of understanding why they come to work every day and do the things that they do. And so having personally worked with development teams, I've worked with folks who have, when they've arrived at WillowTree, their professional success is measured by the number of lines of code that they write, the number of bug tickets that they write up. They're incentivized to focus on productivity. That's not the way we measure success at WillowTree for developers, but I think it's helpful that when you step into a team of people, you have to understand the measures of success that they're being sometimes evaluated against. If you don't know that, I would encourage you to think about that. I think researchers are uniquely suited to understand the motivations for their team. The other key point that I want to call out here is allowing space for the team to work at a reasonable and sustainable pace. I find that teams that are under too much pressure don't have the capacity to be curious about what we're actually chasing and what we're actually doing. I can't tell you the number of kind of instances that I've run into where sometimes I've stepped into a project or something, and then the designers and the UX researchers are feeling like the developers are just telling them no all the time, and the developers feel like the designers and researchers are encouraging them or trying to get them to do more work than they could possibly do. And there really is just kind of this miss of this lack of kind of shared intent and purpose in positive intent, where they're really working towards the same thing. One of the things we're going to get into in the next couple of slides is really talking about time boxes and learning to love those. And I know Jill and I have had a long-standing relationship where we've, built on our, shared desire to understand each other and shared positive intent. We've been able to come up with a language around learning to love time boxes and really helping everyone. The other piece that I want to touch on is measuring outcomes is harder than measuring outputs for developers. And there's a saying that stuck with me a couple of years ago, and it says, if you can't measure what's important, then what you can measure becomes important. And so I'm going to say that again, just to let it resonate. So if you can't measure what's important, then what you can measure becomes important. And so as a product director, on someone that thinks about a cross-functional product, I think a lot about that, because if we think back to our developers who are sometimes measuring their success by the number of tickets that they close out, or the number of lines of code, or the number of bugs that they find, those are very easy things to measure. And sometimes the things that we're talking about UX outcomes, those are more challenging. It doesn't mean that they're less important to measure. It means, in fact, they're more important to measure. It's why we show up to work every day. That's why we build the great products that we try to build. But you have to understand sometimes the motivations that can be behind management. And so I think in this case, having a management team that is aligned with this goal, that the voice of the user is critical to have for product discovery process. And I would highly encourage you, where possible, to find an advocate, find somebody who's willing to champion the user, willing to ask the questions why, and willing to create the space and the environment for the team to be curious and partner closely with that person.
Yeah, Emily was my advocate, by the way.
We also had a great client and a great team, and had this great environment that allowed, you'll hear us talk about this playground sometimes. We had this playground of people who all had a ton of mutual respect and like the shared desire to figure it out. We didn't know exactly what the process looked like, but we knew we wanted to figure out something that worked for us. And so now that we've kind of found that intentional ally, this person who's going to be there with us, we'll talk about how to create the space for quality research. One of the things that, as we go into talking about time boxes, that I want to make sure is heard is that we focus on maintaining research integrity. So when we talk about decreasing timelines, I want to make sure that we're not asking you to do more work in less time. That's really not the goal. And so let's dig into the practical approach of how we did this. And so sometimes the synchronization of all of this is challenging, but luckily working with Jill over the last few years, we've been able to really kind of lean into this and figure out how to move the entire delivery team forward. So this is a roadmap, or you can call it a project plan. You can kind of call it whatever you want. Agile, as Jill said earlier, and we looked at with the Agile manifesto, Agile welcomes changing requirements even late in the game, but that doesn't mean that there can't be a plan. And so what we've come up with here is a practical approach for how we're able to make it work. So roadmaps are not inherently Agile, and they're not Scrum. I'm not talking about building a whole, prescriptive roadmap broken down by 2-week sprints over the next year. But I have never worked on a project where executives and management was okay without having some sort of plan or understandings for when a feature would be releasable. There's a lot of dependencies on these. There's marketing teams, there's coordination with other vendors, right? There's just coordination dependencies that have to exist. So use that to your advantage. Be part of the planning. Jill's going to walk through a case study in just a little bit that talks about how we were able to practically go through this negotiation while meaningfully being able to continue to keep the team working. And so the fidelity that I'm chasing on a roadmap is maybe not wrong. And so for anybody who spent any time around me, it's kind of becoming a meme around the office, is it's not about being right, but it's being maybe not wrong, right? It's a place to start. And being okay that you're not going to be right. There is no right answer. And so at its core, we like to think about Agile as the collaboration and communication. So we review the timeline or roadmap frequently. Things are going to take longer. Things are going to take less time, and that's okay. And so we're going to lean back into the learning to love time boxes. Joel's going to talk a lot more about this, but I think one of the things I love to think about is Parkinson's law. And so it says that work will expand to fit the time allocated. In my experience, it'll also contract and force radical prioritization through right sizing. So again, to make sure everyone hears this, I'm not asking you to do the same amount of work in less time. One of the things that I really focus on is healthy teams that are happy and have the space to think about this and aren't feeling burnout or feel like they're compromising research integrity. So we create a loose roadmap of dependencies. And so when I say dependencies, I mean the activities that need to happen before a product can be released or before kind of a next milestone can be released. And so this allows for time to do intentional work. So for example, the case study we're going to walk through is that research needed to happen before or at times in parallel with designs, which all needed to happen before certain key development milestones were worked on. And so it's crucial here to get alignment on that early on so we can create the space for that to happen. So in the kind of list of things here, if you zoom in a little bit, you'll actually see we outlined 6 weeks for research for a critical feature. So Jill will talk a little bit more in the next couple of slides about how we decide or how we propose to talk about and measure which features we should focus on first and kind of pick those versus which ones can wait. And you'll notice there's different lines here for research, design, and development that allow the development team to stay busy and to keep working while still making sure that we carve out time and intentionality to focus on the features that deserve and merit research and design work kind of before we pass it over to development.
Great, awesome. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit more about those roadmaps and sprints, because this was such a big question in the questions that you submitted before the event. And it's really around how do you maintain that research integrity and rigor and all of that and still be effective and not slow things down. So that's really the rub of it. And so what I would advise is that you need to really critically assess the work that's ahead of you using some sort of a framework, some way that you can look at that roadmap or rough plan or whatever you want to call it, the work that you're seeing, come up in front of you, and figure out where is research going to have the most impact. Now, for me, I tend to argue, I don't find a ton of exceptions to this rule, though I'm sure there are. But if you were to ask me, I think everything boils down to one of two types of things. One is around confidence. How much do you know about a particular problem space or user need or feature set, whatever the case may be. Obviously, if you don't know very much or your confidence is low, that is a point at which you would consider doing more robust research potentially. You could think about how much existing secondary research exists. It's really how well known or unknown this territory is for you, and that's a conversation with your team as well. And then also, related to that is risk. It's kind of the flip side of the coin here, but how critical is the work item that you see coming up to the user experience? I mean, maybe if it's onboarding or kind of login or something that's really fundamental to the value proposition of what it is that you're building, then yeah, it's a higher risk, kind of item if you get it wrong, and if you get it right, the payoff, is big. The other piece of that is how easy or difficult is it to undo the decision? Some things might be important, but they're like, maybe it's the color scheme or, something like that, which, you change a style sheet and boom, you can always pivot later, those types of things. But some of them are really kind of built into the architecture. They're hard to undo. There's lots of other features that depend on that will break if you make change. And so that's a riskier task, and one that if you don't know a lot about, if it's high risk and it's low confidence, you definitely want to spend some more time thinking about that one and doing the necessary research. What dependencies relate to the system? So we talked about this a bit. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but if it is a situation where a lot of other work streams are, looking to user insights to really kind of give them direction on where to go, and or if this decision has a lot of cascading effects, that's something you want to consider in this framework that you're evaluating your research needs. What are your opportunity costs as you are doing research on something, you are not doing it, on something else? So another part of your factor should be like, what is going to have the greater amount of impact to that? So I think if you take all of these things together, and I also think you need to kind of work at what this framework should look like with your team. I think I saw someone in the chat ask the question about sort of conflating like user outcomes and business outcomes and how you negotiate that. That's a whole, I think, presentation in and of itself. But what I will say is that I think the ways we think about risk, for example, are informed by the risk to the business, and it's a valid, perspective to include in your framework. But your team should really talk about how you want to weight different things, and then ultimately, that's going to inform what rigor is needed to sufficiently answer the question. And what I want to leave you with this like evaluation of the roadmap and these sprints is that your job as a researcher is not to skinny down your research into the tiniest chunk of time possible. That is, not your task that you have in front of you. Your job to be a responsible advocate for the user is to understand the potential impact of your work and have that built into the project plan. And I really think that is integral. It's not an extra nice to have thing. So we're going to look at a situation where we had just such a conversation and we applied just such a framework, and we made the case for making more space for research. So we talked about this EV app that we were working to build, and what you're seeing here is just a visual nod to the different the sprints that we had laid out for work that we were going to be doing on that app. The sprints were 2 weeks. That's not written in stone, by the way. I saw some questions come in and suggesting that, how do I fit things into 2-week sprints? It's kind of arbitrary. It's up to your team to decide that. But the way that we laid out our initial plan was that we had these, series of, let's say, 4 sprints, 2 weeks each. The very first sprint was around payments. And the question was around what forms of payment should we accept, particularly like near NFC payments and or credit card, one, the other, what should that look like? Now, this particular question hit on a lot of those considerations in the framework that flagged it for me as something that was going to require some more in-depth user research. There were a lot of unknowns around this because there was hardware involved, just for lots of reasons. A lot of uncertainty that was already kind of an existing pain point, and we really needed to understand it. Because of the hardware aspect, doing some field research seemed particularly appropriate. That takes more time most often. It was also a dependency for a lot of work from not only a design perspective, but like a technical architecture perspective, because that's why we put it in, first in the order of work to be done, because it was so foundational to everything else. But if we got it wrong, it would be really, really hard to undo and probably wouldn't be able to feasibly do it. So that was kind of a flag, or at least a trigger for a conversation that Emily and I had with the team and with the client. And because what we really want to say is if you want to have a good amount of confidence and make the right decision on something so integral to the user experience, it merits more work. Now we didn't slow anything down. I think that's the important thing to note. But what we did, and what you can see on the diagram, is that we moved that payment sprint that development was going to work on to a few sprints down the road. So instead of being the first thing we tackled, it was kind of like the fourth in line, if you will. During that time, what we did the field research, right? So we were answering that question. We made space for it while development pulled forward other lower risk work that they could be working on. But also what research did, and I think this gets to some of your questions about dual track Agile, I think someone called it hybrid model, but as we had this plan in place, we knew what work was coming up to an extent. I could then anticipate in my research questions I should ask users, since I'm doing the field research, I'm talking to them on site, I know what's coming up. I can also ask them some questions that will help me get clarity on that future work. So it really was kind of, kill one bird with 2 stones, if you will, kind of thing. We answered more than one question. So I think we delivered a lot of value to the client and a lot of certainty to the team around this question of payments. And I know that, do you have any notes to add about that and how that conversation, went with the client?
Yeah, and I love that too. And we'll talk more about some of the specific meetings that we can get into, but I think that ability to take the voice of the user and what you're hearing about a specific payment, and even if you're sitting in on meetings where the team is talking about things that you're not exactly doing research on, you can still understand and you still have value for how the user processes information or how they think about problems or how the types of ways that they can kind of lean into it. And so I think it's super helpful to sit in all of those meetings. And I think from an allocation and overall timeline perspective, it was crucial to keep the development team moving forward, which we were able to do by, as Jill said, reorganizing the feature order. But outlining it this way, our client also aligned that, like, yes, this is a highly risky feature that requires a lot of back-end architecture work that is not something that's going to be easily redone. And so as a program director, I'm very comfortable with time boxes. However, over the years, it's funny, I think most of my job or most of the conversations that I've had with designers and researchers, it's kind of funny, it's been learning or kind of teaching them and encouraging to think about time boxes as a plus, because of time boxes and because of a plan, we were able to actually carve out 6 weeks worth of research time to allow Jill to work on this and to allow the designers to work on it, to really make a meaningful impact and allow the client to make informed decisions about how they should think about their product. And again, I know, just to say this again, but Jill has kind of talked about skinning down the research. And when I talk about time boxes, I talk to researchers and designers a lot about, I don't mean doing just as much work. I mean, being really intentional about the types of work that you do to really drive towards the outcomes that we're chasing, and thinking critically about how you spend your time as a researcher and a designer working on these features. And I think at the core of this, sometimes what I've seen around team dynamic issues is that people end up feeling offended and kind of violated, because the work that they lean in to do, researchers and designers especially, and developers as well too, they feel really passionate about the work that they do and they want to build quality things. And sometimes the notion of a time box or having other people push on them and telling them to make their time smaller, they kind of take it personally, and really it's about you being empowered by the time you have allocated to you. And I think that making sure that you lean into feeling like you're being valued and feeling like you're valuing the other people in the team is really crucial to team dynamics and making all of this work.
Yeah, and the other thing I just want to add to that is not that, we in research will like always get everything that we want in terms of the amount of time. I could have used more time, for sure. It still felt tight, like we had a lot of work to do in that time period. But the trade-offs that we make, at least when we have a plan and we're being strategic, are clear to everybody. So I can say, okay, well, maybe we can't feasibly do this, but here's what the consequence is going to be. Our confidence here is going to be a little bit lower, or maybe something else has to go in the backlog for future work or whatever the case, but at least it's just transparent. And I think that is, if you can't get all the time you want, it should at least be done in an intentional way.
Yeah, and I see a question in the chat about defining time boxes. And so it's been a little while since we had that actual conversation, but I imagine it was something like, hey, can I have 10 weeks to have this? And I was like, no, you can have 6.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not about getting everything you want and using that as a measure of success. It's about trying to do the best you can given the constraints that you have. I hope that helps kind of define time boxes. We can certainly dive more into the end of the Q&A as well too. So now that we've talked about how you prioritize and how you make a plan for where you're going to research, we touched on a little bit, but let's talk about more specifically how you can integrate into the Scrum team and get folks curious. And we're going to start off with handing it over to Jill to talk a little bit about user stories and come up with some more of that shared language.
Yeah, I'll be pretty brief with this one, but I couldn't talk about tactics without talking about a fundamental building block that I think is important for us all to understand. That's user stories. So, Emily's going to talk about the product backlog and what that is, but basically it's a collection of user stories that represents the work that the team is going to be doing. And typically, and this isn't something in the Scrum guide, so you're not going to find it if you go look there, but it's a thing you will almost undoubtedly encounter in doing Agile work. But the stories, usually they're in tickets, they could be on sticky notes. They usually follow a particular template. In this case, the template is as a person, so insert your user persona there. I want to do something so that I get some kind of a benefit from it. So just to put it in real terms, let's use the EV example. As an electric vehicle driver who's commuting on business, I want to find a station that's near a place where I can eat and recharge so that I get to work on time and I'm prepared, for this meeting or whatever the case is. Not the best story, but you get the idea. But the thing to note is these aren't all about features. So it's not a backlog of like all the things you're going to build. It's really about the users themselves and what value this unit of work will be delivering. So who knows, more about like where users are coming from and what value they're seeking than researchers. We are not the only source of that information, but we're a really strong source of that information on our teams. So whenever you have a meeting around like user story development, wherever you can add context and help explain to the team, why this is important or what its relative prioritization should be, I think that's a great place that, we can add value. I've sat in on meetings with developers who've been reviewing these stories, and it's fascinating just the detailed, nuanced questions they have about each aspect of this because they have to actually build it. And just listening into that, you can really learn to anticipate what they need to know and have represented here, and keep everything oriented toward the user. So
yeah,
you could do a whole thing on user stories. So I'm going to leave it at that and turn it back to Emily.
Yeah, to stay here for a moment. So there was a question in chat about, has it happened to you that research has not led to valuable or actionable results? And what did you do? And so my comment is, I would argue that all research is important. And so even if you don't find out what you think you're going to find out, that ability to integrate yourself into conversations with the team and help to answer why, and bring that user perspective. And we used to talk a lot about grounding ourselves in the user research and really going back to like, what is it that the user's saying, and then taking that and feeding that and ingraining that into the culture and the ethos of the team and the client and the product is always valuable.
You know, there is an interesting point about that, though, like from recent history around maybe there are insights that you can't use at the time, like maybe 100%. You surface something and then that can create some swirl on the team. And I've seen that too. And so that goes back to those conversations about like research is valuable. What are we going to do with the things that come up that we don't know about? Try to talk about that earlier on because it's going to happen. And maybe the answer is it goes into backlog, or we talk about, do we need to, address it in the retro? I mean, I don't know what the things are, but you should have a method for dealing with them.
And we don't have a slide directly for this. I started to add to the last one, but I want to talk more about it at the Q&A, is how do you talk to about that? And so I think ideally your product owner is going to be your partner. And one of the things that I think a lot about is not surprising them, right? And really being an ally to this person who's being an ally to you, and thinking about the product backlog. But yeah, we can definitely talk more about that and deeper in the Q&A, because you're right, you don't want to cause swirl, but there's always kind of something to add. And I think even if you don't use the research at the same time, I actually, so I stayed on the project that Jill rolled off of it recently, or in the last little bit. And I actually pulled research from that Jill had done like a year and a half ago and integrated that into a presentation for an executive deck, working on some new features that we're working on with the client. And it was really great to speak to the way the customer thought about something. And so even if you can't use it right now, or it's not immediately applicable, it has ways of ingraining itself and like I said, grounding yourself in the user's point of view and the user's voice. Okay, so as a recap, we touched on kind of what the high level all of these meetings are in the lightweight Scrum framework. In the next few slides, you'll notice that some of my descriptions may deviate a bit from the official Scrum guide. I had a great mentor of mine, Larry Banner, and he used to call it Scrum-ish, and that's just something that stuck with me, right? It's not about being by the book, it's rather the shared mentality to kind of figure it out. And what ends up working for Jill and I, or Jill or the team now, is different, and it'll be different than what works for you. And so it's the idea of just kind of figuring it out. And here's a lightweight framework for thinking about how it might work for you. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I found value in everyone being present on all of these calls, but I think that there are a few where researchers are especially crucial. And I think those are specifically the product backlog refinement meetings, the sprint planning meetings, and the sprint reviews. And Jill and I over the years have found that sharing a common language with the Scrum team and the developers and understanding how that team works allows researchers to know where in the process to try to insert themselves to be most effective. So in the official Scrum guide, in the backlog refinement meetings, you'll have a dedicated product owner. In my experience, that isn't always the case. You have a dedicated person who that is solely their job. What's important here is that you identify who's responsible for getting work into the backlog and prioritizing it. Someone, ideally 1 to 2 people, kind of always figure out this role. So identify them, work with them. And you should think about the backlog as the list of user stories, as kind of Joe was saying. It's a list of work to be done. It's continually refined through backlog refinement meetings. They're led by the product owner. And this is really an opportunity for researchers to be present and to help ensure that unmet user needs are represented, and continually reminding and grounding the team in the outcomes of the work and the why they're doing it. It's easy for teams to sometimes focus too much on the story points. So if you haven't heard that phrase before, it's a way to kind of quantify the velocity of a team, of how fast they can go, how much kind of work capacity they can fit in. By contrast, researchers, I find, have the effect of kind of pulling people out of the specific numbers and the specific velocity, and really thinking about why is it we're doing what we're doing, and what is the unit of work that we're going to release and really be effective and lean into for the end user ultimately. Sprint planning is another opportunity that I think is a great one to lean into. So this one, typically the product owner will kind of outline the product vision for this increment of work. And the development team, I will commit to a certain amount of work that they're going to fit into the next 2 weeks. It always happens prior to the start of the sprint. Typically, the sprints that I work on are 2 weeks or anywhere from kind of 2 to 4 weeks typically. And I think these are great opportunities for the researchers to support the product owner and reminding the development team again why this work matters. And I think any opportunity you can take to talk about the research work that's scoped as well too, and the things that you're working on, it just brings everybody back into the tangible reasons of why we're doing what we're doing. And as we talked about before, really staying away from that outcomes of how many tickets did you do, or how many lines of code did you write, or how many bugs, right? It kind of pulls you out of that and reminds you why you're doing what it is, and always encouraging the team to be curious about why and to ask questions and engage, and just kind of creating those conversation lines. And the last one is the sprint review. So having worked on large teams of designers and researchers, there is something so satisfying when you look at designs that are no longer in Zeppelin or Figma or any of these other tools, but they're real. Like, they've been coded, they're getting ready to ship to developers, and it just makes, I sometimes call it, we play in a little bit of a playground of design files or talking to users, but until code is actually shipped and given to users, you really haven't solved any of their problems. And so for me, sitting in on these sprint reviews or these demos, it's really just this fun time to support developers and to see your work just kind of come to life. And I think it's another one of those just kind of like really good relationship building meetings. And when you talk about user stories, you can't perfectly document every aspect of the product. You shouldn't strive to, right? That's waterfall. People would spend 6 months or a year trying to document all of those things. And this is Agile and Scrum really aren't about that. But the more that you can talk to developers about why you're building a certain product and what you're trying to do, and then you can see kind of their interpretation on it. And so the more you have those communication lines, the better, and then get to see everything come to life. The other piece is that a lot of times at these meetings, you have more than just the direct Scrum team. So the Scrum team, as a reminder, is the product owner, the Scrum master, and the developers. A lot of times executives will come to these meetings and it's their chance to see the work that's been done and getting ready to be released. And so they'll have key pieces of feedback that are from the industry or from the business perspective that might encourage you to think about things a little bit different, or hear what things are more important to them, and then see if you can't lean into doing some research and finding out what you can for them. I think anything that you can do to kind of build relationships across the organization and help be a voice for the user and support the business in leaning into those things, I think is always a good opportunity. And this is a chance to really celebrate success and work that's all been done, and then also talk about and use this to kind of inform your research plans as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to wrap this up really quickly because I think the Q&A period, if you're, game to hold on, I know it's been a long session, will be really rich and valuable for folks. So I'm just going to be real brief and summarizing what we think are the key takeaways that you all should walk away with. We talked a lot about the fact that intentionality matters, and having that kind of shared mindset with teams is really very critical for just starting out on the right foot and getting the right groundwork. So think about those outcomes, get aligned on why you're doing the work that you're doing, and that will, serve you well for the future. Time constraints are actually a good thing. This is where you think critically, you think about what's in the best interest of the business, the users in particular, and how do we make good decisions with the resources and time that we have. And this really challenges us to do that and articulate that and think about it. So we actually deliver stuff for people, and ultimately that's what we want to do. Agile is a conversation. You're going to see tickets and whiteboards and sticky notes and all of these externalizations of, Agile. But really, it's about being curious, listening to one another, understanding dependencies, but being empowered as a researcher to take part in that dialogue. And then, as I think you've heard me say, research definitely has a place in Agile. I just don't see it as one of these things that you can elect to have or not have just because you feel like it. It's the way in which we maintain focus on user outcomes. We drive product success. We get competitive advantage from all of this information that we're surfacing. And not to say it doesn't happen, from other contributors, but we have the expertise and we know the methods. We know how to apply them properly. We know how to bring them together, across studies and things like that in a way that's, rigorous and intentional. And I think that cannot be underestimated. So I want to empower you. I don't know if I'll get to all of your questions today, but you are more than welcome to reach out to Emily and or myself at any time, because I want to see you all be successful and be really invaluable partners in this whole effort. So I'm going to stop talking, and I know Anna has been managing kind of the chat and may have some questions for us.
Yes. Wow. Jill, Emily, thank you so much for taking us on the journey and sharing your perspective and how you collaborated together. The thing that definitely stuck with me was the pizza party. Now I'm definitely hungry. But on a serious note, I really loved what you mentioned, Emily, about if you can't measure what's important, then what you can measure becomes important. I had to process that phrase for a few seconds, so I appreciate that you gave us time and repeated it. But I've seen that definitely a lot of times happening in teams. So thank you for sharing your perspective and reminding us all that research has place in Agile. So we are moving to the Q&A session. You've been really amazing at already answering some of the questions from the chat. If you do have a question, feel free to add it to the chat. If you are brave as well, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question directly. You can also raise your hand so we can avoid multiple people asking a question at the same time. I did note some of the questions from the chat, and also we have a lot of questions from the meetup registrations. A lot of them I think have been already answered by Jill and Emily. So I'm just gonna see if anyone wants to unmute themselves maybe, and otherwise, if not, we will go to one of the questions we noted from the chat and from the meetup registration. Anyone wants to speak and take the stage? I'll give you maybe some moments to see if you, okay, I see Joey. I don't know if that's the correct name pronunciation, but please go ahead.
All good. It's all good. Hi, everybody. Hi, Jill.
I know that guy.
Real quick question that I've been pondering for a while is about traceability in a lot of areas of design. Have y'all put some effort into formalizing some sense of traceability from a research event to a finding that goes into some aspect of a story that then is realized and traced to the interaction design and thus the application? And the second part of that really also is, have you experimented with having multiple stories? Because as a fill in the blank obviates the use of personas or archetypes or whatever, as a user takes away all of that other part. How do we get that traceability of all these nuances throughout the entire project?
Yeah, it's a huge question, such a good one. And I'm not just saying that, Joe. I have some immediate thoughts, but I know Emily and I have specifically worked on this on the project we've been referencing. So just in terms of collecting questions, not particularly results, I have used basically Trello to keep a categorized list of the questions that we want answered, so we can kind of pull from that repository when we see problems coming up that relate to them. So that's one way to kind of continue our capacity for learning. But in terms of the results, one of the things that we tried with success was using kind of sticky notes and Figma files, because for that particular team, Figma was the source of truth, really. And so I don't know if you want to say anything more about it, since and how you all are using it, but
yeah. So in our thought with that is how can we make this about passive digestion of information? How can we avoid developers having to go look through research reports or things like that? And so if we can put things front of mind, so those developers or anybody's going through and just looking at a flow or looking at a file that they're going to be in naturally anyways. And so we came up with this notion, it's called sticky notes. And so it's just these little like blocks that look exactly like virtual sticky notes in Figma. And I think those have been pretty successful for us. And so we would, so our team managed all of our work in Jira because like I said, we try to focus a lot on shared understandings. We use the word sprints. We make ours shorter because that was kind of how responsive we needed to be. But yeah, I think that was effective for us. And then I think we also went through a phase where we consciously, intentionally talked about research every day and how research was going to influence the designs that the designers were working on immediately, and then how we can incorporate that into the conversation with developers. So it just, for us, everything comes back to that intentionality of creating the space and the intention and playing with figuring out that way.
And I've been thinking a lot more about how we make the user stories do some of that work, capture some of the breadcrumbs or pointers back to a particular insight, things like that. And I don't know that I have a real refined process, but I think that conversation with the team and being able to anticipate questions and explaining where the context, came from and capturing that in a way that's going to be like you said, the place where people are going to naturally go is kind of the key. And that varies, I think, across teams. So those are things we've tried. I think there's lots of ways to do it too, but for what it's worth, that's our experience.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jill and Emily. Yeah, it's also kind of good to remember that you kind of need to adapt to the context of your organization. So obviously, if your organization is using Figma and that's where they are, it's good to use the tool. But if your organization is completely using something else, it's kind of, again, applying this research mindset that you were talking about and kind of researching your teams, understanding which tools do they use, what are their processes. So I really love that advice. I see we have a raised hand from Kim. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, please. Hi. So let me give you a little bit of a backstory about the situation that I'm kind of struggling with, and I'm not sure how to handle it. But I'm a researcher on my own, so I'm like a UX UI designer in a company, but I'm a beginner, and we have no one else in the company that actually does that job. So I'm having like a small team of some developers and my boss, who I get some feedback for. But I'm struggling with the fact that I don't have deadlines, and I'm not sure how to make like a roadmap. Like you said earlier in the beginning, you talked about the roadmap, but I'm not sure how to start with that and how I can implement that on like the projects that we're currently working on. Do you have some advice maybe, or some tips that might be helpful?
Yeah. And Kim, do you have a sense of what is important within your organization, your team, or what those organizational goals are by chance? Is that clear to you, or is that not?
Yeah. Well, I came to the organization, and we developed web design, so websites, and we also want to make some applications. But the last thing is like new. But since I came there, we started to have a brainstorm, like what is our ideal client, and our ideal client is someone we can have a partnership with. So that we have like UX projects that we can like do over time. So that's like a longer relationship than just, hey, here's a website and that's everything we want to do. So we want to engage more with the client and make sure that it's continuous improvement of their websites, so that their end users actually like getting the job done that they want to have done with the website, instead of just a static website.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of who makes the decisions about what the development team works on next?
Yeah, those decisions are made by our well, actually the boss and the project manager. So they just have like tasks, and those tasks are being prioritized by what comes next.
Yeah.
So that are
Sorry, go
usually
ahead.
the things that, that are usually the things that, occur over time, and they just have to be done, or like a newer project that has to be finished for now.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like maybe you're not quite at the place where a longer term roadmap is going to be really easy for you to kind of put together. And I'll be honest, like we talk a lot about roadmaps in here, but things sometimes come up that just have to happen, and that's just the way that it is. What I would encourage you to do, or something that I've found success with when I've kind of worked in cases like this, is you hear a lot, you listen a lot, and then a lot of times I'll just put together a project plan or a roadmap, because if I wait for somebody to do that, it's kind of too much of a load for them to do. And so then I'll take it to that project manager or to whomever that person is and say, is this right? Is this maybe not wrong? Like, is this something that I can then start to think about? And what I find is it's easier for them to tell me where I'm wrong than it is for them to create something entirely from scratch. And so that might be something that you can try. And then to your point about not having deadlines, I would encourage you to think critically about how much time you want to spend on something and give yourself a deadline. Because I think that goes back to Parkinson's law, that if you don't have a deadline, work will expand to fit the time that it has. And instead, if you think critically about how much time you should spend on something, or how much value is going to bring to the user, or as Jill was talking about the framework about the costs and the risks and things like that, and think about what logically makes sense, like how much time should you spend on this versus the value that it can get for the users, and just kind of start there.
It's interesting.
Yeah,
I say this something similar. I'm sorry, Kim, go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Yeah, I was just listening. Yeah.
I think externalizing the work is something like you're doing actual work and getting that work in a visible form so that someone on the outside can, have some kind of commentary about it. I think would be a great conversation starter. Like, is this off base? Does this seem like an important problem? It helps with that conversation. So, and you don't have to be doing Scrum. Something that comes to mind that we started back in a previous organization where our agile maturity was very low, we started looking at just Kanban, that's something, or Kanban, you can look that up, but essentially it just, you limit the amount of work that you're actively working on and just see how it progresses through the flow from beginning, middle to end. And it can help you kind of understand your capacity and help other people understand what it is that's in progress. And again, that's another, I think, really, really good touch point.
Yeah, exactly. Because the funny thing is, we do have someone who actually is certified as a Scrum Master, but they're not using that person right now, which is kind of a shame, and which I think would be valuable. But yeah, because I'm kind of struggling with the fact that I'm not sure how to implement a certain roadmap or where to start. It's kind of hard to tell them you should use your skill by being a Scrum Master.
Yeah. Start where you are. That would be my advice there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim.
It's also about maybe kind of finding your friends. I mean, not like literal friends, but this person, you kind of can partner with them. You can learn from them. You can, as Emily was saying, bring them something and ask for feedback. Maybe they can help you. So maybe you can kind of work on this together and kind of slowly start bringing this person in yourself as well in your work.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Well, thank you for your question, Tim, and thanks again, Emily and Jill. I know you also just mentioned now kind of you might be in a company with low UX maturity, and I also saw a question in the chat, and we got a couple of questions during the meetup registrations. Of course, everyone's context is quite different. You might be a team of one, you might be a solo researcher, and you might be in a less mature company when it comes to UX. I think you already shared some tips about this, but I'm wondering, is there anything else you would advise to UX research practitioners who are in kind of more who are maybe solo researchers, or maybe they don't have a big I'm losing my voice, sorry. Maybe they don't have a lot of UX people who can become their allies. Maybe the maturity is quite low and their organization is quite focused on the outputs, and you might feel quite lonely. What can you do as a researcher in that case?
Yeah, there aren't, I don't think, easy answers to that. Those are hard cultural problems to solve, but and I don't mean to sound redundant or trite, but I do think really having a mindset of focusing on the problems. Like we as researchers are experts in problems. Like we help to define them, we help to kind of address them and bring more certainty to them. And I think that's one thing we share in common with all of our delivery teams too. And I suspect if someone who's very, maybe people who don't understand what researchers do, start engaging with people in different disciplines, talk to designers and developers, and just figure out the problems that they're working through, the product problems, the project problems. And I think then the conversation becomes, how can we partner to solve this problem? Hey, did you know that I have this information over here, or, we know that users like X, and that could really help bring clarity and efficiency to what it is that you're doing. It's amazing what questions people don't ask because I don't know that they can. So they'll just continue on doing what they're doing. But once you can kind of open up, as Emily said, that curiosity among people, I think that's kind of where it starts. Not entirely satisfied, but I know we have so much to bring and it seems like a baby step, but I don't know. I think it all comes back to people and relationships and relating at what do we all have in common. So that's my general piece of advice for that.
Yeah, and then I saw the question in there too about being one researcher across multiple products. I just want to acknowledge that was our reality.
Yeah.
And so I think it's something too that I just kind of want to acknowledge across, especially researchers and product designers. You guys are perfectionists. We love you for it, but you're also a perfectionist. And so be okay knowing that you're not going to be able to answer all of the questions for all of the people. And it really comes down to radical prioritization and doing something well, not perfect. We're not chasing perfection, but doing it well. And so in this particular case, we focus on the app, and our project still spans 4 to 6 different products. And so what we do is we radically prioritize across that, because if we think about the end user, they touch all of these different products, and we think about a problem that they're solving for that. And so they can then take the research that we're working on for specific design feature or specific feature at the moment, and then you'll get learnings that will apply to other products as well too, because you think about solving problems for users. So be okay and not let it overwhelm you. Just pick one, decide, make a decision, move forward with it, make progress, and then do something different.
And as I just add as a solo person, something about Kim's question made me think of this as well, is that if you know how long it takes you typically to do a study, if it's about 2 weeks to do a usability test with X number of people, including recruitment, analysis, whatever, I feel like a lot of us have that intuitive sense of how much capacity we have. And our job isn't to stretch ourselves so thin that we're exhausted, because that's another question that I had, but we need to be empowered to make smart choices with our time and be able to articulate that back. And that's kind of an empowering thing for a researcher to do. Here's how I am dedicating what limited time I have to solve this problem. And here's the impact it's going to be, have. If we want to continuously improve this website, we're going to focus, the next couple of sprints on conversion rates, and we're going to see if we can't move that needle. And, just take bites of it like that, but be strategic about it, because I think that can really boost your credibility.
Yeah, and I think around that too, as we talk about timelines or how long something takes to do, I think every person on my team would tell you they kind of imagine me sitting on their shoulders saying how much work can you actually get done in a day? How long is this actually going to take you? And not because I'm worried about the deadline, because everything always has a way of working out, but I worry about people getting hung up in that perfectionist mindset and working themselves to where they don't have the capacity to be curious and they get burnout. And so I talk to the teams, I talk to every researcher and designer I talk to a lot about burnout and a lot about being okay with not being perfect, but doing the best you can by the user and by your team and by yourself and by everyone.
Yes, totally. A lot of us can definitely relate to it. And it's nice to see your reflections, Emily, on UX researchers. It's good to see how we seem to other people working with us. But I think definitely also, as Jill said, it can be unsatisfying to feel those baby steps. We want to come in and already have a research first organization that focuses on user needs and everything is amazing, but it unfortunately takes a lot of time and effort to kind of get there, and we need to start small, start with understanding the teams, talking to them, participating in activities, and then kind of scaling it up. Well, looking at the time, I think we have maybe time for one last question. I see a lot of people also kind of thanking you and for all the kind of the great insights. Maybe just since we're kind of finishing off, I just want to give you, Jill and Emily, kind of the last word. Is there any kind of one last takeaway or tip or kind of the thing that you want to leave everyone with as we're rounding this Q&A and session up?
I have one thought from the researcher point of view, and I'll let Emily speak to her point of view, but I've said this a lot, but I really encourage all of you to just know that the work that you do is integral to the success of products. And I think if we know that ourselves, it makes us better advocates when we're engaging with other groups, because you have to be convinced of that. Like, we're not a nice to have. If you want human-centered products, we are a need to have. And then our teams, and we need to like work together to bring that to life. But you're not imposing on teams, you're not pushing yourself, you're really, you're helping the business, you're helping your colleagues, and you're helping really the world and end users. So I love researchers. I love the impact that we can make. And so I just want to encourage you all, keep at it. Reach out to me and Emily whenever you want. I get on calls with people just to chat through these problems, and totally happy to do that.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's be present, ask questions. Like it's gonna feel weird talking to developers because a lot of developers have never talked to researchers. And so just like engage with them, build relationships. We all know that it's easier to talk to people once you have that relationships. And I think for me, everything comes down to building those relationships, building those open lines of communication. And that's why we talked about some of the things that worked for us. But you have to recognize too, like, we haven't always been like this. There was that time where you just have to build the relationships and relate on a human level. And I think that's really the start to giving you the foundation to figuring everything else out.
I love this. Thank you so much. I think a good takeaway is go talk to your developer tomorrow. If you don't know them, it's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Jill and Emily. It's been so many insightful learnings. I think a lot of people are also sharing this in the chat. Thank you for answering the questions. Unfortunately, of course, we cannot cover all the questions, but please connect with Jill and Emily on LinkedIn. Their links are in the meetup description. Feel free to connect with us from UXinsight, Anna, Karen, and Debbie. We're here. You will receive an evaluation form from meetup.com. So please give us feedback. We're also kind of researchers, you know, so please tell us how your experience was. And, you know, also, if you want to stay tuned for future meetups, for the recording, we will share that in the newsletter, and you'll receive also updates if you were registered in the meetup group. So I just want to thank again Jill and Emily. Let's give them a little round of applause or whatever. If you don't have your video on, you can put an emoji or add it to the chat. But please connect with them and share what you learned in this session, and let's keep this conversation going beyond this meetup. For sure, we're not going to solve this big topic in 1 hour and a half, but it's a good start.
Thank you.
Yes,
Best wishes to you all.
Yes.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Have a lovely day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And thanks again, Jill and Emily.